Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm also still adjusting from East Coast time, but we're getting there. Coffee is here. So today I'm excited to share a set of recommendations on how to make evidence-based policies to save for your state's next rainy day. I'll also provide just some context about why Pew has been taking a closer look at this issue in the last couple of years. And of course, the primary reason is that rainy day funds can be a powerful tool to smooth volatility over the business cycle and can help lessen the need to make difficult business choices in the worst of times. So we've developed some guidance for states looking to harness volatility during times of growth in order to build an adequate financial cushion for use in future tough times. But before I dive into the details of our research on this particular area, I just want to give some context. So first, this is how total state reserves looked in 2008 as we headed into the recession. This is a very broad definition of reserves. This is taken from NASBO data, so it includes general fund ending balances and rainy day funds. And in aggregate, states had about $60 billion in reserves going into the recession. But in 2009 alone, the first year of the recession, states faced total budget gaps of about $117 billion. So in 1 year alone, shortfalls outstripped savings nearly 2 to 1. And of course, we know that this was just the first year. Most of you went on to face budget shortfalls for several subsequent years. Now, obviously, the Great Recession was not a normal recession. It wasn't a typical downturn. But it did highlight the need for states to save more and to think a little more critically about how to build a deeper financial cushion that may have been previously considered sufficient. And this is also a good time to be having this conversation, to be thinking about this policy area, now that state revenues are finally starting to recover. And so here's an illustration of state tax revenues. What Pew has done in this analysis is to identify each state's own peak quarter of tax revenue collections and then index quarterly change to each state's own peak. So this is the 50-state aggregate view. You see that in 2008, just a few months into the recession, is when total state tax collections peaked. They then, of course, fall for 5 straight quarters to a low of 13% below that peak level. And then it takes 14 straight quarters of growth before you see tax collections finally edging back above pre-recession levels in the middle of 2013. So it took a long time, but state tax revenues are starting to recover. Again, this is an aggregate picture. Of course, not every state has seen full recovery in its tax collections. And we know that at the same time, spending pressures have increased as you've been going through this period. So there's still a lot of challenges as states are trying to balance their budgets. But even as these challenges persist, this is a good time to start thinking about how to plan ahead for the next downturn. And there are some steps that states can take now to put policies in place to make sure those financial cushions are available for the next time. So here's also a historical look at reserve funds across the 50 states. This, again, is still a broad measure of reserves. And what we've done here, just as an easy way to compare states, is calculate the number of days a state could run on its reserve funds alone. So this is total reserves as a share of operating expenses. And you see the 50-state median peak in fiscal 2007 going into the recession was about 41 days of operating expenses. And then obviously you see that states did use their reserves after both recessions this century, which we would expect to see. That's appropriate. That's what reserves are for. And that states have now been starting to rebuild their reserves as state tax revenue has recovered. You see a little bit of a drop down between 2013 and 2014. That fiscal 14 data is still preliminary. It was based on projections given over the spring. And the likely downtick there reflects the fact that many states did use reserves. Given that there was sort of an unexpected spike in collections in 2013 and then some lower than expected tax collections in 2014, including, of course, the April surprise that many of you had to deal with, so a slight downtick there in 2014. But we do see that states are starting to think about how to rebuild their reserves, and this is a good time to be thinking about it again because recent research shows that volatility is increasing in tax collections. So this has always been a challenge, but may be kind of a new or an increasing challenge that states are facing. So our work at Pew on state budget policy has focused on the challenges of volatility and the fact that although volatility in both economic performance and tax collections varies widely by state, it is a challenge that all states have to manage. And we've been looking more closely at rainy day funds because they can be this powerful tool for harnessing volatility in times of growth. And our new research, just flew onto the slide there, focuses on what characteristics of rainy day funds in particular can help states grow adequate reserves and how states can improve their current policies to better harness volatility. One question we asked in our research kind of going into all of this is why is it that states hadn't saved very much going into the recession? And we found that in most states, saving for a rainy day isn't prioritized either in the budget process or during times of growth. And even though many of you experienced pretty strong revenue growth through the 2000s, very few states actually set aside a significant share of that money for use in future downturns. So we have identified some steps that states can take to make savings a reliable and consistent practice. So, of course, with any complex problem, the first logical step is to study what the issue is. And in this case, it is volatility as it manifests in your state. And then this study can inform the next two major decisions, which are when and how should you be setting aside funds for your rainy day, so that's the deposit rule side, and then how much do you need to be saving, how big should you let your fund grow. And then when we look to see what states are doing this, where do we see some promising practices here, we identified just 12 states that currently link rainy day deposit rules to some measure of volatility. The other 38 states in this map that are not highlighted, many of them do have rainy day funds. There are just 4 that don't have budget stabilization funds meeting our definition. And those 38 states, we discuss it in more detail in the report. They use a range of approaches, including a measure of year-end fiscal condition, forecast error. Some states make ad hoc deposits. But I'm going to focus particularly on these 12 states that are considering volatility as they set aside money for a rainy day. So, of course, they all take slightly different approaches. 5 states tie to overall revenue volatility. 4 states connect deposits to particularly volatile revenue streams, so things like spikes in severance taxes or capital gains. And then 3 states connect deposits to broader measures of economic conditions, which also, of course, drive volatility in your tax collections. So none of these states is considering volatility in exactly the same way in designing their rainy day fund policies, and no state has really managed to define the perfect deposit rule or set of rainy day fund policies yet. And of course, some of these rules, even among these 12 states that I've highlighted, some rules work better than others, where savings during times of growth is a measure of success. So one other thing that I think is interesting to note about both volatility in general and how states design these policies is that you see a broad fluctuation in volatility levels across the United States. So what I'm showing in this map is a 20-year trend of state tax revenue collections where we're measuring volatility as the standard deviation of year-over-year change controlling for legislated tax policy changes. So what that means is that standard deviation is the amount of variation from the mean. So a low number here means that year-over-year changes are relatively consistent, and a big number means that you're seeing much more dramatic fluctuations over time. And again, we've scored states' own tax revenue data and like a CBO style kind of analysis in order to control for some of the effects of tax policy changes. So this is the 50-state picture, and then here you see highlighted again those same 12 states that are considering volatility as they manage for their next rainy days. And I think something that's really interesting here is that you see a significant range in the levels of tax revenue volatility across states that have implemented these kinds of policies. So of course, our host state, Alaska, most revenue volatile state in the nation, has also, of course, been thinking about some of these issues for a very long time and has a number of strategies in place for how to manage severance tax revenue in particular. But then you also see states like Washington, which has a relatively low level of revenue fluctuation year to year, but has also taken a similar approach to thinking about how to manage the volatility that does exist. So my point here is that there are a lot of opportunities for states to revisit their rainy day fund rules and make them better than they already are, regardless of what your state's experience with fluctuations actually may be. And since there are not many states that have rainy day fund policies in place with volatility in mind, there are a lot of examples of missed opportunities for savings during times of growth. So as we were doing this research, we started to wonder what kind of position would a state be in if the state doesn't have a deposit rule currently connected to volatility. What if they'd had a rule in place that did consider volatility? So we picked a state, we picked South Carolina, which is, I think, a good example because it represents some challenges on both the deposit rule side and the fund size side. And we applied a rule from a state that does consider volatility. So that we used Virginia's rule and applied it to South Carolina's conditions. We've run these kind of counterfactual simulations for a number of states. And there are a few presented in our report. We've also done some in direct technical assistance work with states. This is just to demonstrate kind of the scale of the missed opportunity, how things could look different. This is not a specific policy recommendation for South Carolina. So just to give some quick background on these two states, South Carolina has a rainy day fund. It does not consider volatility when making deposits. They maintain a static mandatory balance of 3% of general funds in their rainy day fund. So there's the cap that you see. And here is how their rainy day fund actually looked as it accumulated over the 2000s. They built up a balance of $168 million heading into the recession. Now, Virginia uses a deposit rule that considers historic revenue growth, and when revenue growth exceeds a historic trend level, they set aside a share of that unusual growth in their rainy day fund. So if South Carolina had taken a similar approach, their savings would have looked like this. They would have had $853 million, which is nearly 5 times more than what they actually had going into the recession. Now, of course, the state had to face budget shortfalls of about $4 billion over the recession, so this still wouldn't have it would have made up all the difference. There would have still been significant challenges, but the state would have had substantially more budget flexibility in how to deal with those issues heading into the downturn. Just a couple of notes before I move on. I just want to point out that we, of course, recognize that choosing to save can be a difficult choice, and it often comes at the cost of other budget priorities. But I think as we think about long-term budgeting, it's important to remember that making tough choices during times of growth can help lessen the need to make much harder choices during difficult times, when you may be forced to cut spending in ways that are hard for your residents to tolerate, or to raise taxes when people can least afford to do that. And linking savings to volatility is a smart choice because it prioritizes savings during those good years and ensures that you have a deeper cushion available during downturns. And again, this example that I've just walked through is, of course, an example that we invented. I think it's an interesting illustration of the opportunity here, but this is something that we fabricated. But one interesting example and a real example of a state that is considering some substantial changes to its rainy day fund is the state of California. California has not previously considered volatility in how it saves for a rainy day, but a ballot measure will go before voters in November that will overhaul the savings plan substantially. What you see up there are a couple pieces of analysis that my colleagues and I have written about this proposal. It's complicated, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of elements, but I want to highlight just a couple of things that California is considering as relates to Pew's research on this topic. So first, through an analysis of California's own tax portfolio, the state identified that collections from capital gains revenue were a substantial driver in their overall experience of volatility. So in order to manage volatility in this one tax source, this proposed plan would set aside a share of the spike in capital gains whenever it rises to sort of a dramatic threshold. The state would set aside a share of that in its rainy day fund. At the same time, they've created this kind of hybrid rule where they'll also set aside a static portion of general fund revenues. So they're kind of blending an approach that will allow regular, consistent savings but also help to manage a known source of volatility in their tax collections. And the state's also considered some really pragmatic, kind of smaller administrative concerns that come up in designing these kinds of policies, including making sure there's a way to suspend deposits when there's a downturn. You don't want to be forced to keep pushing money into your rainy day fund when you need to also be pulling money out of your rainy day fund. So they've thought ahead about some of those concerns, and also just some of the other logistics about how to account for capital gains collections. So again, this is a very complicated proposal. It has a lot of elements, but those are just a few pieces that are in line with some of our research on promising approaches. So just to summarize our recommendations here and what we think those promising practices are. The first is that states conduct a regular volatility study to inform your rainy day fund policy. Volatility looks very different in every state. There is no one-size-fits-all approach, and understanding exactly what's driving revenue volatility in your state and how that changes over time is critical to designing practical policy solutions. I think one really interesting example of a state that's done this just in the past legislative session is Illinois. They just authorized the first ever comprehensive study of volatility in their state. And we know that Illinois is facing some other really significant budget challenges at this time, but even still they're thinking ahead about how they'll manage for the next recession. Our second recommendation is that we recommend states design or redesign their deposit rules so that they are linked to observed sources of volatility. Since this is going to look different state to state, states have to consider their own drivers. Massachusetts is an example of a state that's done this well. They've implemented a rule similar to the one California is now considering, where they set aside a share of spikes in capital gains into the rainy day fund in order to manage volatility in that one revenue stream. And then third, on the fund size question, we recommend that states establish goals for their rainy day funds and then set fund size targets that meet those goals. There is no single optimal size. There, again, is not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. I know we still sometimes hear about that 5% threshold, but setting a single threshold for every state isn't going to allow states to effectively manage their own revenue volatility. Minnesota is an example of a state that did something very interesting in this last legislative session. They've designed a pretty complex methodology for evaluating budget risk in each biennium, the likelihood of experiencing a downturn of a particular size in that budget period, and then determining each biennium how much they would need to set aside to offset that risk. And another strong feature of this proposal is that they've developed a mechanism to regularly reevaluate. So as volatility changes over time, you want to make sure that you're continuing to save as much as is necessary to offset those kinds of budget risks. So that concludes my remarks. I would encourage you to please check out more of our writing on this topic at pewtrust.org/fiscal health. We've the reports that I mentioned today are up there, as well as some more state-specific analysis and some summaries of work that we've done in specific states around this issue. So thanks very much. I look forward to your questions.